Today I want to point you to the most pathetic story in all the Bible. It's a story of a man who was born a slave, yet rose to the pinnacle of success and finally became the most abject failure of any man in human history. This man was really born in the Roman Empire as the lowest of slaves. Now, back in those days, it was customary for slaves to be mustered automatically right into the armed forces of the legions of Rome. Now, you can imagine there was not much loyalty among this particular class of individuals. But the man I'm talking about was a very brave man and a very ambitious man as well. And he rose just as high as it was possible for a man to go as a slave in the legions of Rome. In fact, this man's bravery and his mighty deeds of heroism were carried far and near until finally they came to the ears of Caesar himself. And in recognition of what this man was doing for the empire and the contribution he was making to the kingdom, Caesar actually changed his status and made him a free man so that he could go higher as an officer in the armies of Rome. This man became one of the most loyal servants of the emperor. In fact, if the king sent him out there to fight a battle, he would bravely lead the army out there and win the battle. For example, when he was sent over to fight against Sicily, he went out and won that battle and then came back to lay the prize at the feet of his master. Finally, after a very distinguished military career, this man retired from the armed forces and went back to Rome amidst the grateful applause of the people he had served. And there, again, in recognition of what he had done for the kingdom, Caesar actually invited him into his own household to live out his years of retirement there as a member of the royal family. And while this man was living in Caesar's home, in his retirement, he met a very beautiful relative of Caesar by the name of Claudia Popula, fell in love with her and wooed and won her hand in marriage. Now, after his marriage, this man began to look around for something to do. You see, most of his life had been spent amidst a clash of arms. And this quiet, sedentary life of retirement didn't agree with him very well. He was restless. He wanted something to do. Now, at that time, there was just one great trouble spot in the Roman Empire, and that was Palestine. It was a seething, sizzling, boiling pot of sedition and unrest. So this man submitted his request to Caesar that he might be appointed as the governor of that province. And after due consideration, that request was granted. And very soon afterward, this man moved his family from Rome over to Jerusalem. Now, in the Bible, of course, this man's name is called Pontius Pilate. He was a fierce, dogmatic individual. He was a corrupt man also. And he hated the Jews with a purple passion. You know, sometimes just for the fun of it, he would dress his soldiers up as Hebrew worshipers, and they would go right into the sacred assemblies with the Jews themselves. And when everybody was gathered together, they would whip out their weapons and beat the poor Jews unmercifully. Now, this kind of thing went on, getting more severe, and the tension kept mounting and mounting and getting worse until finally the whole thing seemed to come to a climax and the incident over the aqueduct. You see, Pilate had insisted that the Jews help pay for this public project out of their temple treasury, and they refused to do so. And so Pilate gathered a group of soldiers and marched down there, determined that he would forcibly extract the money from the treasury. But the Jews heard about this, and so they massed themselves out in front of the temple and prevented him from carrying out his plot. Now, later on, the Jews learned that 16 men had been responsible for foiling their plan. And so soon a messenger came running to tell Pilate that all 16 of those men were worshiping together down in the temple area. So he gathered a contingency of soldiers and marched down there and slaughtered those men right there before their altars. Their blood mingled with that of their sacrifice. You'll find that story, by the way, in Luke chapter 13. And so this situation kept on deteriorating, getting worse and worse. One protest committee after another went to Pilate, trying to intercede with him, to get him to back off a little bit on the pressure he was putting upon the Jews. But this man who had never been defeated in all his life would have nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. In fact, he told them that they would do what they were told to do, or else there would be plenty of trouble. Now, friends, this was the situation when Pilate came face to face with Jesus of Nazareth. I think you know the circumstances of that event. Jesus had gone out, you remember, on that Thursday night with his disciples. He wanted them to pray with him out there on that mountain and in that garden during that long night, because he needed them at that time. But you know, the flesh was weak, and the Bible says that they slumbered and slept there. And then very early in the morning, there came this mob of people with their swords and their staves, determined that they were going to capture Jesus and put him to death. And his disciples fled. They left him there. And they dragged Jesus on into the judgment hall. Now, this was very, very early in the morning, friends. But these Jews were so determined to kill Jesus that they were even willing to defy the law. You see, it was illegal for anybody to be tried in the darkness of the night. It was still night. And so here they went now, taking Jesus to bring him before the authorities there and get him sentenced to death. You see, they couldn't put a man to death. There was no way for these religious authorities to actually execute any kind of capital punishment upon anybody. That had to come from Rome. And the stamp and seal, at least of the government, had to be behind any kind of capital punishment. And they knew that. But they were determined to do it. They hated this man more than anything else. He was a competitor with the people for their favor. And so here they went now, dragging him in there in the darkness of the night, actually determined they would get some sort of a sentence against him so they could go ahead and put him to death. But you know, friends, when they came there into Pilate's judgment hall, he was still back sleeping in his chambers. It was too early in the morning for him to ever be about his official duties. But these leaders of the Jews were so angry, and they were so determined to get rid of Jesus, their personal enemy, that they even dared to send a messenger back there to arouse the sleeping governor out of his own chambers. Now, I have tried to imagine the disposition of that governor on that morning. I mean, here were these people that he despised. And here they were coming back and daring to disturb him out of his sleep. I can imagine that as he dressed himself to go out there, his face was contorted with fury, his fists were clenched. And he was determined to get out there and get this business over with as quickly as possible so that he could get back to his sleep again. And then I have tried to imagine the impact of that initial confrontation as he came in there and took his seat at that bench and looked over into the face of that prisoner standing before him. My friends, Pilate had never in his life seen such purity, such holy innocence upon the face of anybody. And he must have stood there almost transfixed as he looked over into the face of that accused man, his face slowly relaxing, his fist slowly unclenching. And then he stood looking at that man before him. And my friends, I believe right then, at that moment, the Spirit of God began to work on the heart of that tyrant governor. I believe some strange new feelings began to stir in his heart, maybe that he had never felt before. He knew immediately and instinctively that this man was innocent. He could see through that whole thinly disguised plot of the Jews to get rid of one of their personal enemies. And he could see the very stamp of heaven on the face of that man. It was so open, it was so obvious. He was not guilty at all. This was a setup. This was a plot. He saw all of that. Now, friends, don't misunderstand me today. Pilate was not a good man. He was not a just man. He was not even an honest judge, and he had sent many an innocent man to their death. No doubt about that. But somehow on this occasion there was a strange and mysterious constraint upon him. There was a new spirit struggling within him as he looked at that man. And I believe, of course, that that was the Spirit of God. And he was convicted that somehow, by some means, he must release this man. He must have nothing to do with this man. And so there began within him a tremendous turmoil and battle that I'd like to follow with you, as we take note of the 5 steps Pilate took in his downward course of self-condemnation and destruction. And I would like to remind you today that every single one of us can take those same steps if we allow ourselves to do it. And I want us to recognize what Pilate did, and to understand that you and I also are faced with some very similar decisions that he had to make that day. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, the first step that he took, and the first mistake he made, was this. He tried to dodge the decision. Have you ever tried to do that? Have you ever been faced with an unpleasant choice? something that was being thrust upon you, some situation into which you were pressed, and you knew that you had to do something about it. You just couldn't stand aside there and be neutral. You had to make some kind of a decision. Well, now Pilate tried to dodge that decision. It was his official duty, of course. It came in the lines of his authority, but he didn't want to do it. He would take care of any other business in the empire. He would dispatch any other matters, but he just didn't want to have anything to do with this man because of these strange new feelings and convictions that were stirring within his soul. So he just wanted to put Jesus aside there and let him be and dodge the decision. Now, friends, if you have ever been tempted to do that same thing, I want you to take note very carefully with me today what happened to Pilate when he tried to do this. And then make sure that you never try to do it again. Listen, when Jesus Christ knocks at the door of your heart and you try to get rid of him and dodge a decision that he's demanding that you make, friends, you'll never be the same again if you turn him away. You will not. We have to answer that knock at the door of our heart. Pilate stood there trying to think of some way that he could get out of this, and that he could dodge a decision, and suddenly it came to him. Why, somebody had said Jesus of Nazareth. And that meant really that this prisoner didn't even belong in his docket at all. He belonged over there in Herod's court. And so he called soldiers to his side, and he gave them orders, and they led the prisoner out the door and down the cobblestone street on the way out to that other court. And Pilate turned around, congratulating himself and feeling that he had made a very astute decision and that he had avoided a very unpleasant situation. But my friends, you can't get out of the decision that easily, can you? You can't do it. If you've tried it, you understand that when Jesus is standing there and you're asked to make a decision about him, you can't avoid it very easily. Because soon there were shouts out in the street and the door burst open again, and here they came, those soldiers bringing the prisoner again, and there he was standing once more in front of Pilate. You see, Herod wanted to just play games with Jesus. He wanted to see him work some miracles for him and do some tricks for him. And Jesus wouldn't do it. He didn't even respond to him. He wouldn't even answer him. And finally, in a petulant state of anger and even rage, Herod sent him away and ordered him back. And now the soldiers come bringing Jesus, the prisoner, and he's standing once more in front of Pilate. And now he stood there trembling and trying to think of some other alternative. What other option was open to him? He wanted to avoid this thing at any cost. What could he do? And then we find Pilate making his second terrible mistake in his downward course. He decided to lower the standard just a little bit and compromise just a little bit with his own convictions. And he made this announcement to the people. He said, look, I find no fault in him, and I want to let him go. But because of what you're doing and what you're saying, I will have him scourged, and then we will release him and let him go. Now, friends, I wonder, have you ever been tempted to do the same thing? To lower the standard just a little bit in your own life? To compromise the truth maybe just a little bit? To shade things over a little bit, to give not quite a full and accurate picture of the way things are? Well, if you have, listen to me as I tell you what happened to Pilate when he tried to do the very same thing. He said, all right, I'll compromise with you. I'll lower the standard. I don't believe he's guilty. I believe he's innocent, but nevertheless, I'll go along with you and we'll scourge this man. Then we'll let him go. You see, Pilate was really gambling this time. He felt that if those people could see the awful spectacle of a Roman scourging, their lust for blood would be satisfied. And they'd be glad to release this man who was so obviously innocent before them. And so he had Jesus brought and positioned there in front of that mob. Now, friends, I don't know whether you know anything at all about a Roman punishment or not, but I want to describe it for you. Maybe you don't even know about this kind of an open public scourging that took place so often in those Roman tribunals. I'll try to describe it. They brought the prisoner. He was stripped down to the waist. And then they called out the roughest and most brutal soldier in the Roman legions to administer the punishment. And the instrument of punishment was that long whip with leather thongs interlaced with bits of sharpened steel. And the soldier stood quite a distance away, and he brought that great whip or scourge around him with all of his strength, and it would wrap around the naked body of the prisoner, and the flesh would be lacerated, the blood would flow, and the suffering was excruciating. And Pilate stood there and watched as the blows came down upon the body of the innocent prisoner. And oh, friends, I can believe that his old tyrant heart was almost moved to tears as he saw the patient suffering of Jesus. You see, Christ didn't retaliate at all. There was no anger, no revenge. He stood there calmly with the peace of heaven written upon his face, benign, no show of anger, not even irritation. It almost seemed like the hatred of that crowd was rolling up there and breaking at his feet like a tide on the shore. It didn't touch him. It didn't affect him. There was no reaction, apparently, on the part of the prisoner. And Pilate took note of all that. And then after it was all finished, he turned to the crowd and he said, all right, now we will let him go. He suffered enough. This is it. I find no fault in him. We'll turn him loose. But then, friends, there came a great roar back from that crowd. Oh, no, they were not willing to do that. And they cried out the more for him not to be released. And then somebody out there in that crowd must have said something that made a tremendous impression upon Pilate. It seems from what we have in the Scriptures that somebody out there must have said, listen, you've declared this man innocent, and yet you've punished him and scourged him publicly here. We will report you to Rome for this. And then Pilate realized that he had made a terrible mistake. Indeed, he had violated one of the very basic tenets of Roman law. He had declared the man innocent, and yet he had ordered him to be punished. And now this was going to be reported to Rome. His position would be in danger. His job might be taken away from him. And so Pilate made his third mistake, friends, on his downward course. He decided that no matter what it would cost him, no matter what would be involved, he would have to hold on to his position, hold on to his job, no matter what it cost him. And I tell you today that that was one of the very worst mistakes he made. Listen, you can violate your conscience by trying to hold on to your position, can't you? You surely can. There are a lot of things more important than your job or your friends or even your family. We have to put God first in our lives, friends. And let's not ever make the mistake that Pilate made that day in deciding that he would have to keep his job and maintain his status and his position there in society, in government, in his work. Oh, that's not nearly as important as being true to our own conscience and to follow what God reveals to us. But Pilate made that mistake, and now he stood there trembling, pale, perspiration on his face, and trying to probe in his mind for some other alternative, some other way of escape from this dilemma in which he found himself. And then suddenly it came to him like a flash of unholy inspiration. Why, of course, this was the time, this was the season when any prisoner could be released, whomever the people might require and request. And so he called a soldier to his side. And he sent that soldier hurrying back through those maximum security doors of the inner prison, where Barabbas was languishing. That violent, evil man who had rampaged over the countryside, attacking people, killing people. And they feared this man. Oh, he had become a terror to the community. And everyone locked their doors and bolted their doors and feared the very name of Barabbas. And now, here they brought Barabbas out of that prison, and Pilate had him positioned there right beside Jesus. And the two men were there together. Pilate, his face contorted with evil, the beady eyes of a professional criminal looking out with malignity upon those people. And then there was Jesus standing there with a very radiance and peace of God on his face. A holy beauty and a holy innocence shining forth as he stood looking kindly and benignly upon those people. What a contrast. And of course, this is what Pilate wanted. This was another one of his plans and his ploys, that perhaps he could escape by having these two men there. He could see himself the obvious contrast. He wanted that crowd to see the contrast too. And he wanted them to understand what it would mean if this criminal was released again, and how he'd be once again attacking and destroying the people as he went around on his crime activities. And so the two men stood there. Pilate must have given plenty of time so that they could fully see and comprehend exactly what was before them. The two men and their natures. Then he asked his question. You remember, of course, what the question was. And he did it with great deliberation, no question about it. And this man was a man of authority. I think Pilate spoke with a lot of power and authority. He was accustomed to ruling men and dealing with men and ordering armies and so forth. And he could stand before a crowd and make a great impression. And he must have stood there then and quite confidently asked that question, which he anticipated, of course, the answer, but which brought back the wrong response. He said, "Whom will ye that I release unto you?" And perhaps for just a fraction of a moment, it may have seemed that his gamble had paid off. Maybe there was just a moment of silence. But then there came back that surprising cry from that crowd, and they said, "Release unto us Barabbas." You see, Pilate could not believe his ears. He must have stood there, confused and confounded, and asked the question again. And once more the same answer came by. And then, I suppose in a voice that was quite querulous with fear, he said, "What then will ye do with Jesus, which is called the Christ?" And then came that great roaring response from that crowd. And I'll tell you something, my friends, demons were out there in human form that day, weren't they? Speaking out of human voices. And they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate just could not believe it, friends. And he stood there, no doubt, quaking and trembling and realizing that his very last avenue of escape seemed to be closing up before him. Now listen, what was he doing? He was taking his fourth step of self-destruction. That's what he was doing. You see, friends, he believed that he could remain neutral in this thing. Can you be neutral when it comes to the claims of Jesus Christ, friends? Can you? You can't do it. Have you ever tried to do it? Maybe you've tried to do the very same thing that Pilate was doing that day. Have you felt that you didn't want to really get involved? Oh, you were a Christian, all right, but you just didn't want to let everybody know about it. You didn't want to talk about it. Pilate, I don't believe Pilate wanted anything to do with destroying Jesus. I think he wanted to release Jesus. He wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to help him. But in doing so, he was afraid to take a stand. And so he just stood off there and tried to be neutral. Oh, the Bible says, "He that is not for me is against me." That's what God says. My friends, you can't be neutral. You've got to take a position. You've got to either crown him or crucify him. You've got to accept him or reject him. Which is it with you? Which will it be with you today, friends? Will you crown him or crucify him? Are you afraid to acknowledge him? Are you ashamed to acknowledge him? Don't be. Don't be. Boldly make your decision. He didn't know what to do now. All the doors seemed to be closing up around him. And he was trembling. Oh, I can just imagine him as he stood before those people now. And his face was pale, and he was quaking in every joint of his body, wondering what he could do now and what the next step might be. And as he stood there, suddenly a messenger came pushing his way through the crowd and raced up in front of Pilate and thrust a scroll into his hand. And he began to unroll it, and there it was, a letter from his wife, Claudia. And in this letter she had written, "Dear Pilate, have thou nothing to do with the blood of this just man. For I have suffered many things in a dream because of him this night." And Pilate stood there reading those words, and he began to fear even more, because even his wife now was receiving a message apparently from God warning him against destroying this man or having anything to do with his condemnation. And oh, how he must have been full of terrible fear at that moment. Say, have you ever wondered what those many things were that God revealed to Claudia that night in that dream, friends? I've tried to imagine what it might have been, and how it must have come to her so vividly and so graphically that she was inspired to sit down immediately and write this letter to her husband, interrupting him in his official judicial duties. Oh, it must have been a very fearful and terrifying dream that she had that night. You know what I think, friends? I think maybe God took her back in that dream, through the years, through the centuries, maybe all the way back there to the very beginning of this world. Perhaps she saw this earth after it had been created there in all of its beauty and glory. She saw it lying in its perfection. No sin, no blot or flaw whatsoever in all of creation. And then maybe she saw the entrance of sin into this world for the first time. And she saw the earth becoming more dark and more polluted by transgression and sin. Maybe she saw those long centuries of time when God sent prophets there to warn His people, to try to draw them back and keep them on the right path. And then maybe in her dream she was brought down to that day and that night when the star was shining so brightly over Bethlehem. And she saw those shepherds come and the wise men come. And she saw the little baby there lying in the manger. And she saw Him being worshiped by those who came to bring their gifts. And then perhaps she was taken on past that and saw this young man as he grew up and began to go around from village to village teaching and preaching and healing the people. She watched him in her dream as he did those miracles, going from place to place. And then in her dream she was brought down to that very moment when this man stood before her husband and he was seated upon the judgment bench, and she watched that scene in her dream. And then perhaps God even revealed to her what happened afterward, and there were the 3 crosses on the hill, and the earth was shaking, and the man was dying between 2 thieves. And then maybe God took her on past that, even into the years of the future, down to our own day even and beyond. And maybe she even saw that glorious moment described by the prophets of the Bible and the writers of the Bible about Jesus coming back to this earth again. And there perhaps in her dream she saw the skies lighted up with that brilliant glory, and then the clouds rolled back like a window shade, and there was Jesus coming with all of His glory and all of His angels. And as she beheld this in her dream, and she saw the people standing around as they looked and beheld it all, she heard someone say, "And we believe in Him who died by Pontius Pilate crucified." And she woke up in a terrible fear, and she called for a servant and a quill and began to write, "Dear Pilate, have thou nothing to do with this just man, for I've suffered many things in a dream because of him." And now Pilate is standing there reading those words with shaking hands and wondering, what can he do now? The options have all run out. The doors have all closed up in front of him. And there seems to be nothing left for him to do. Oh, my friends, if ever a man's conscience burned within him, Pilate's did that day. Don't you believe that? Oh, he knew exactly what he ought to do. He knew what he ought to do and what he had to do, but he wasn't willing to do it. He wasn't willing to do it. You see, he still had that idea that he could be neutral, that somehow he could let other people make those decisions and he wouldn't have to get involved. That's impossible. That's impossible, my friends. And so finally, in his desperation, Pilate said, "Bring me a pan of water." And they brought it in and placed it before him, and he washed his hands in the sight of those people. And he said, "I find no fault in him. Let his blood be on you. I'm washing my hands of this man. You take him and deal with him as you will." And they led Jesus out along the way of sorrows on the way to the outer gate. And Pilate turned around thinking that he had avoided it at last. But my friends, this was his 5th and fatal mistake that he made. He thought he could get rid of his guilt and his condemnation by merely going through some sort of a physical act of washing his hands. You can't do that. Oh, friends, there is no other way to be rid of our burden of sin and guilt until we do it through John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life." You won't get relief and deliverance from your sin and guilt and condemnation, my friends, by doing something physically. You can't even work your way out of it. You can't perform any act that is so good and noble and commendable that God will recognize that as the justification of your life and give you freedom from sin. Oh no. The only way that you'll ever find that is to have John 3:16 break right through into the middle of your life, where you see yourself as a sinner, lost and condemned and dying, and you see Jesus on that cross giving His life for you and taking your place in death. When you believe in that, friends, and you take Jesus as your Savior, then you pass from death to life. But only then. You don't get it by your works and by going through all kinds of outward ceremonies and actions. Pilate thought he could do it by just washing his hands. But that didn't do it, friends. They took Jesus and led Him down that road called the Way of Sorrows. They came to the outer gate. Through that gate, along the path, winding up there to the hill of Golgotha of Calvary, he was carrying that heavy cross on his shoulders. And they arrived at the place of the crucifixion. And there 2 thieves had been brought. 2 criminals were to die with him on either side. They placed Jesus on that cross, stretched out his hands upon those bars, and his feet upon the tree. And then, my friends, angels of God looked down upon that terrible scene as it transpired on Golgotha. Those angels saw these men who were unworthy to touch the hem of his garment take those terrible nails and the hammer, and they drove those nails through the trembling flesh of Jesus. They drove it into those hands, my friends, that had created worlds, that had hung planets in space. The hands, I tell you, that had even created the tree upon which they were now nailing him. These men, unworthy to touch the hem of his garment, rebellious, evil men, spit in the face of the Son of God, the one who had created them. Those hands that had touched the brow of the sick and even the dead and brought them back to life again. Those feet that had wandered over the dusty paths of Judea and Galilee, going from village to village and bringing health and healing wherever he went. Now those feet are being nailed to the cross by those men, I tell you, who were unworthy to even look on his face. Oh, how you and I would benefit if we could have looked down on that scene with those angels, my friends. I'll tell you something, if you had seen it, and if I had seen it, we would never accommodate sin again, would we? If you knew what it cost Jesus, my friends, to pay that atoning price for your sin, you would never allow sin in your life again. You would turn away from it with hatred and abhorrence. And they nailed him there, and Jesus hung between heaven and earth for you and me. And my friends, I want to tell you something today. Jesus was not dying the same kind of death that other men died. You see, Jesus was dying the second death, not the first death at all. Sometimes we think of him as being some great martyr. Oh, no. That sacrifice that Jesus made on that cross was not just the ordinary death of a good man or a martyr at all. Jesus was taking your guilt and paying your debt and suffering your punishment, and the punishment for sin is death, the second death of the lake of fire. And when Jesus was hanging there, my friends, his Father had to withdraw from him so that he would die the same kind of horrible death that the sinner would have to die in the lake of fire. And so that's why he cried out in his agony there, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? You see, the Father treated Jesus that day as though he were guilty of every sin you have ever committed, that I've ever committed. And he had to leave him there to drink the dregs of that cup alone. And he died in the same kind of separation from his Father that the wicked will suffer as a result of their sin. And he did that for you and me. Oh, we can never understand that, friends. We'll never be able to explain it. But I'm glad he did it, aren't you? I'm glad he did it. Pilate went on about his business, trying to console himself that it was all just a kind of bad dream. And it would fade away after a while, and he'd forget about it. But you know, friends, he couldn't forget about it. Because those little rumors and reports kept coming back to him all the time. Rumors that Jesus was not really dead at all, that he was not out there in that tomb where he had been buried, but he had been raised from the dead. He had been resurrected from the grave. Pilate tried to push it aside, and ignore it. He knew that it couldn't be true, and yet it bothered him. In fact, it bothered him so much as those rumors and reports persisted that finally he couldn't stand it any longer, and so he called to him that centurion who had been in charge of the men and the soldiers that day. And he asked him the question. He said, look, I know this is not true. It couldn't be. There's nothing of substance to it. But nevertheless, he said, I've been hearing this, and I want to find out what you know about it. He said, I have been hearing that Jesus is not really dead out there at all, that he's no longer buried in that tomb, that he's been raised from the dead. Tell me, what do you know about this? And my friends, I can see that centurion turn pale and drop his head and begin to stammer. And I could see Pilate reach out and grab him by the throat and say, man, your life is worth nothing to me. Tell me what happened out there. Tell me now. And then the story begins to pour out. Yes, we were there. And we had the guard well stationed. We were on duty that night. But he said in the middle of the night as we were on guard, suddenly there came walking into our midst this tall, shining being. And he went over and touched that rock, that stone, and it rolled away from the tomb. And then he sat on it. And he cried out and said, Son of God, thy Father calleth thee. And he said the one who had been inside came walking out. And we all fell down like dead men. And then we began to stumble into the city to make our report. But on the way we met the priest. And they offered us money if we would not give any report, and they promised to take care of it if this thing were ever known. And then for the very first time, Pilate knew without any shadow of doubt that he had crucified the Son of God. A terrible trembling seized him. A short time after this, Pilate was called back to Rome to answer to some of the charges that had been brought against him by the Jewish people. And on his way, the Caesar died who was ruling on the throne, and a new emperor was installed. And when Pilate arrived there, he did not recognize Pilate at all. He was dismissed from his position anyway. And he began to wander the streets of Rome as a drunken wretch, until finally, in his misery and his remorse, he took his own life. Somebody has written a poem entitled Pilate's Prayer. Why did I yield, O God, if God there be? Why have I been so blind, too blind to see that my reluctant sentence lay on me? He died in agony beneath the blistering sun. Upon a cross of shame he died, but one I thought to save myself at any cost. I kept my palace and my crown, but lost. Yea, all I seem to have is slipped away. My friends, my land, my hope, my dreams of ease and pleasure. My very life, it seems, is one vast sepulchre filled with hideous bones. A carnal house of fear and ghostly tones, of memories that throng the fetid air, like black-winged ravens of defeat, despair. Thus fallen to the depth am I, who might have been still wearing kingly honor, loved of men. I see but awful emptiness and gloomy end, nor any soul who cares, nowhere a friend on whom to call. They mock and curse me now, who once were glad before my feet to bow. No more can I endure. It seems to me as well to end with my own hands this living hell. And so Pilate took his own life. Oh, friends, today I want you to see you yourself sitting on that judgment bench. Because we're there. Did you know it? We're there. And Jesus is standing before every one of us. And the question comes ringing down through the ages into every heart of every person who is listening to my voice today. And that question is, what will you do with Jesus, which is called the Christ? What will you do him, friends, with him? What will you do with him? There's not very much choice, only two choices. You can either crown him or crucify him. You see, Pilate wanted to fall down and worship before the feet of Jesus. I'm convinced that he began to see more and more that this had to be the divine Son of God. This had to be that Messiah that he'd heard about, that the Jews were always talking about. And this conviction had grown in him. And he wanted to do it, but he was afraid to do it. You see, these 5 fatal steps held him back. But you and I today are facing that very same question. What will you do with Jesus? Either you accept him or reject him. Either you crown him or crucify him. There's no other way. There's no neutral position. There's no choice beyond this, friends. What will you do with Jesus? Will you turn from sin and allow him to be your Savior? Will you accept him into your life to obey him and to honor him by keeping his law, by showing your love for him, by responding to him in submission and surrender? Is that what you'll do, friends? That's the only thing that we can do that'll be right. How can we reject a Savior like this, friends? Oh, I wish somehow that we could see the picture of ourselves sitting on that bench and Jesus standing before us. And the question is, what will you do with Jesus? Listen, the time is coming very soon when that picture is going to be reversed. And He will be seated upon the judgment bench, and you will be standing before Him. And the question then is this: what will Jesus do with you? And what we do with Him now is going to determine altogether what He does with us as we stand before Him on that day. Somehow I wish that it could be impressed on our minds so vividly and graphically as it was upon the mind of that great Scotch theologian, Alexander White. You know, he had a dream one night. It was such a terrible dream that he was crying out in his sleep. And finally his wife Mary had to shake him awake from the sleep. And she said, Alex, what's the matter? You were screaming and crying in your sleep. Oh, he said, Mary, he said, I had the most terrible dream I've ever had in my life. He said, I dreamed that I was standing in Pilate's judgment hall. And I watched them bring Jesus in there. And they stood Him before that crowd and they stripped Him down to the waist. And then I saw this big bruiser of a soldier take this long whip in his hand. And he stepped up there to my Lord and he brought it around with all of his strength. And oh, Mary, he said, I saw the blood flowing. And I saw the flesh of Jesus so lacerated. He said, it broke my heart. And then I saw Him bring that great whip back again, and I couldn't stand it any longer. He said, I sprang forward and grabbed the soldier and held his arm. And Mary, he said, he turned and looked at me. And he said, I was looking into my own face. He said, I was the one with that whip. I was the one who was beating my Lord. And Alexander White broke down and wept in the night as he remembered that dream. My friends, the Bible says that we can crucify the Son of God afresh. Have you read that in the Bible? We can crucify the Son of God afresh. You know how you do that? You know how you do that? Listen. In your imagination, in your mind, now go back to that hill of Golgotha outside the walls of old Jerusalem. Come back with me to that place of the crucifixion, friends. You look once more at Jesus as He hangs there on that cross. Why is He suffering there? Why is He dying there? Listen, He was dying because of your sin. He was dying because of my sin. And if you could think right now the very worst thing you ever did in your life, the most shameful, evil thing you ever did in your life, that you were the most embarrassed about, the thing you would like to forget more than anything else in all the world, if you could just blot it out of your mind. If you could think of that very worst thing you've ever done, and I could think of the worst thing I ever done, and we could all put those things together. My friends, Jesus was paying the penalty for those sins that you and I committed. And if we continue in sin, do you know what we're doing? If we continue to sin, we're adding to that load of guilt that crushed His life out on Calvary. You see, Jesus did not die because of the physical indignities of that cross. Not because of those nails in His hands and feet, or the spear in His side, or the crown of thorns on His head. That is not what killed Jesus. Jesus died of a broken heart. He died because of that crushing weight of your guilt and mine resting on Him there. And every time we sin, listen, every time we sin, we're adding a little more guilt to that load that killed Him on that cross. Oh, friends, how could we do that? How could we keep on walking in disobedience to God? How could we keep on refusing to accept Him and acknowledge Him and commit our lives to Him? How could we do that? Oh, if there's anyone here who has not made that surrender and that decision to go all the way with Jesus, I want you to do it today. I'd like to invite you to do it. There are some here maybe who have never been baptized. You've never really sealed your love and devotion for Jesus by making any kind of an open public decision to follow Him and to belong to Him and to be His child forever. I'd like to ask you to do it, friends, today. I really would. I'd like for you to settle it once and for all that Jesus' death on the cross has made it necessary for you to respond to Him, and that you want to do it. You don't want to continue in sin. You don't want to keep away from Him or to be separated from Him. You want to come to Him and be a part of His family. It may be that there are those here who have been baptized after the example of Jesus. But you've learned new things here in the crusade. You've learned about God's law and God's love and a lot of the beautiful truths that Jesus taught. And you know you should do those things too. You should begin to keep the Sabbath. You should begin to follow all of the great counsel that you've discovered from God. And so you would like to make the decision, even though you've been baptized, you need to come and make that decision to follow these things that you've learned and to go all the way with Him. As we sing our song this morning, I'd like for you to come also. And then one other group of people, and that is the backsliders. Perhaps someone here has turned away from Christ and you've lost the joy of salvation. You don't have that peace and joy in your heart that you once knew. And you need to come back to the altar of God. You need to return to Him and open your heart and life to Him again. Shall we stand together as we sing this beautiful song? Our cameras are off here at the front, so don't be afraid as we sing this song, Come Just As You Are. Please come now as we sing, friends.